The salt wind carried mockery through the narrow streets of the coastal town that morning, sharp and cold as the Atlantic spray that whitewashed the weathered buildings. Sarah Chen stood on the cracked sidewalk outside the county assessor's office, clutching a single sheet of paper that trembled in her grip, not from the wind, but from the weight of what she had just done. The paper bore an official seal, a transaction number, and a property address that most people in town had already dismissed as worthless years ago. $800. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. That was all she had left after 3 months of searching for something, anything, that might change the trajectory of her life before it collapsed completely. The building she had just purchased, sight unseen, was described in the listing as a beach shack, condemned structure, severe structural damage, water intrusion, mold contamination, no utilities, sale as is, for demolition or salvage only. The realtor had laughed when she called to inquire, not cruelly, but with the kind of bemused sympathy people reserve for those making decisions born from desperation rather than sense. He told her she would be better off putting that money toward rent somewhere else, anywhere else, because what she was buying wasn't a home. It was a liability wrapped in rotting wood and rusted nails. But Sarah had no other choices left. The eviction notice, taped to her apartment door 3 weeks earlier, had been the final stroke in a series of blows that had driven her and her 2 daughters to the edge of survival. The landlord had been patient, more patient than most, but patience had limits, and hers had been exhausted by 6 months of partial payments and promises that never materialized into full rent. Her job at the call center had disappeared when the company relocated overseas. Her savings had evaporated, paying for her youngest daughter's emergency appendectomy, and her car had been repossessed 2 months ago, leaving her dependent on buses that rarely ran and favors from neighbors who were growing tired of being asked. She had spent weeks sleeping on a friend's couch with her daughters Emma, age 9, and Lily, age 6, squeezed beside her in a space barely large enough for one person. Every morning, she woke before dawn to search for work, for apartments, for anything that resembled a future. Every evening, she returned with nothing but exhaustion and the growing fear that she was failing her children in ways she would never be able to repair. The beach shack had appeared in an online auction of seized properties, the kind of listing buried so deep in search results that only someone truly desperate would find it. The photos showed a structure that looked more like a shipwreck than a dwelling. Walls sagging inward, roof panels missing, windows shattered or boarded over with plywood that had itself begun to rot. The description warned of extensive damage from Hurricane Iris 7 years prior, structural instability, and the likelihood of total loss. But it also listed an address in a town by the ocean, a place she had never been but imagined might offer something different than the landlocked city where every door had closed in her face. And the price, $800, was exactly the amount she had managed to scrape together by selling everything she owned of value: her grandmother's ring, her laptop, her daughter's bicycles, even the winter coats she knew they would need, but convinced herself they could do without if they just moved somewhere warmer. She told herself it was an investment, a risk, a gamble that might pay off if she could fix the place up, make it livable, create a home where none existed. But deep down, beneath the justifications and the fragile hope, she knew the truth. She was buying it because she had run out of options, because sleeping on someone else's couch with 2 children was unsustainable, because the shelter system was overwhelmed and the waiting list stretched months into a future she couldn't afford to wait for. She was buying it because even a condemned shack by the ocean was better than nothing at all. The transaction completed in minutes. The clerk processed the payment with the same detached efficiency she might use for a parking ticket. Barely glancing at Sarah's face, as she slid the deed across the counter. "Congratulations," she said in a tone that suggested she knew exactly what kind of property Sarah had just acquired and felt no need to pretend it was cause for celebration. Sarah folded the deed carefully, slipped it into her worn purse, and stepped back out into the cold morning air, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, or the only decision that might save it. Her sister called that afternoon. The conversation started with concern, shifted to frustration, and ended in anger. "What were you thinking?" Her sister's voice cracked with disbelief. "You spent everything you had on a condemned building? You didn't even see it first? Sarah, you have 2 kids. You can't just gamble with their lives like this." Sarah tried to explain, tried to articulate the calculations she had made, the spreadsheets of costs versus benefits, the hope that she could repair the structure with her own hands, that she could create something from nothing, the way their parents had done when they first immigrated, with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone thought possible. But her sister wasn't listening. She was too busy listing all the ways Sarah had failed, the irresponsibility of the purchase, the selfishness of dragging her daughters into a situation that would likely end with them homeless anyway, but now, with no money left to fix it. The call ended with her sister saying she needed space, that she couldn't watch Sarah destroy herself and take her nieces down with her, that maybe it was time Sarah considered letting someone more stable take care of the girls until she got her life together. The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She sat on the edge of the couch that night, her daughters asleep beside her, their breathing soft and rhythmic in the darkness. She thought about her sister's words, about the doubt that had been planted not just in her sister's mind, but in her own. She thought about the building waiting for her 200 miles away, a structure she had never seen except in photographs that made it look like something even demolition crews would hesitate to approach. And she thought about the alternative, admitting defeat, surrendering her children to someone else's care, accepting that she had failed as a mother, as a provider, as a person capable of navigating the world without collapsing under its weight. The next morning, she packed everything they owned into 2 duffel bags and a backpack. She borrowed a friend's car with a promise to return it within a week, loaded her daughters into the back seat with their few remaining toys and books, and started driving toward the coast. Emma asked where they were going. Sarah told her they were going to their new home, a house by the ocean where they could hear the waves and feel the salt air, and start over in a place no one knew them. Lily asked if it had a yard. Sarah said yes, even though she had no idea if that was true. The drive took 4 hours, winding through highways that gradually shifted from industrial sprawl to rural farmland, to stretches of coastal pine that smelled of brine and decay. When they finally reached the town, it was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of weathered buildings clustered along a single main street that dead-ended at a pier stretching into grey-green water. Most of the storefronts were shuttered, their windows dark and dusty, their signs faded to illegibility. A few fishing boats bobbed in the harbor, their hulls streaked with rust and seagull droppings. The air smelled of low tide, fish, and something else, something that reminded her of old wood left too long in the rain. She stopped at a gas station to ask for directions. The attendant, an older man with sunburned skin and eyes that had seen too many tourists come and go, looked at the address she showed him and raised an eyebrow. "You buying the old Houston place?" Sarah nodded. He shook his head slowly, not unkindly, just with the resignation of someone who had watched people make bad decisions before. "That place has been falling apart for years. Hurricane took half the roof off, water got inside, mold spread through the walls. Nobody's lived there since before the storm." "You sure you got the right address?" She assured him she did. He gave her directions, his voice carrying a note of something between pity and curiosity, and wished her luck in a way that made it clear he didn't think luck would be enough. The road to the property was narrow and unpaved. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. More a dirt path than a street, winding through scrub brush and dunes that rose and fell like frozen waves. When she finally saw the structure, her breath caught in her throat, not from awe, but from the crushing weight of reality, colliding with hope. The beach shack was worse than the photos had suggested. It sat at the end of a sandy lot overgrown with tall grass and wild vines, tilted slightly to one side, as though the foundation had given up trying to hold it level. The exterior walls were weathered gray, the wood swollen and splitting in places, the paint long since scoured away by wind and salt. The roof sagged in the middle, several panels missing entirely, exposing blackened rafters to the sky. The windows were either broken or boarded over with plywood that had warped and cracked. The front door hung crooked on rusted hinges, one corner dragging against the threshold. Behind the shack, maybe 50 yards away, the ocean stretched to the horizon, its surface churning with whitecaps under a low gray sky. The sound of the waves was constant, a deep, rhythmic roar that felt less like comfort and more like a warning. This was what $800 had bought her. This was the future she had chosen for her daughters. This was the home she had promised them. Emma stepped out of the car first, her face blank with shock. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Is this it?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with something that felt like grief. Lily climbed out next, looked at the structure, then back at her mother with eyes that held a question she was too young to articulate, but too smart not to feel. Sarah forced a smile, the kind that parents wear when they know the truth, but refuse to let their children see it, and said, "It needs some work, but we can fix it. We can make it beautiful." But as she stood there, staring at the wreckage of a building that seemed to embody every mistake she had made in the past year, she wondered if she had finally reached the point where even her own capacity for denial could no longer sustain her. The shack waited, silent and broken, offering nothing but the promise of more struggle ahead. The first night in the beach shack was the longest night of Sarah's life. They had no electricity, no running water, no heat beyond the thin blankets they had brought with them. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the smell of salt and rot, and something else she couldn't name but instinctively distrusted. The roof leaked in 3 places, rain dripping steadily into buckets she had found in the wreckage of what might have once been a kitchen. The floor creaked and shifted under their weight, the boards soft with water damage, some of them punky enough that she feared they might give way entirely if she stepped in the wrong place. Emma and Lily huddled together under a blanket in the least damaged corner of the main room, their faces pale in the dim light of the battery-powered lantern Sarah had set between them. They didn't complain, not out loud, but she could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty, the dawning realization that this was not an adventure, but a disaster. She tried to comfort them, tried to tell them stories about how their grandparents had started with nothing and built a life through hard work and determination. But the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. Her parents had been young and strong and arrived in a country full of opportunity. She was 34, exhausted, and standing in a building that should have been condemned years ago. She spent the next morning exploring the property, forcing herself to look past the decay and search for anything salvageable. The structure was roughly 1,200 square feet, divided into 3 rooms that had once been a living area, a bedroom, and a bathroom. The bathroom was the worst. The fixtures rusted beyond use, the floor rotted through in places, exposing the crawl space beneath. The bedroom was only slightly better, the walls stained with mold, the ceiling bowed inward from water weight. The living area, where they had spent the night, at least had intact walls and a floor that seemed mostly solid, though she didn't trust it enough to let her daughters run or jump. Outside, The yard was a tangle of overgrown vegetation, dune grass, wild roses, and something that might have been a garden once, but had long since surrendered to entropy. A rusted chain-link fence marked the property line on 3 sides, the 4th open to the beach and the ocean beyond. There was no garage, no shed, no outbuildings of any kind. Just the shack and the land and the relentless wind that never seemed to stop. She made a list of what needed to be done. A list so long it filled 3 pages of a notebook she had brought with her. Roof repair, window replacement, floor reinforcement, mold, remediation, electrical wiring, plumbing installation, wall repair, insulation, painting. The list went on and on, each item representing hours or days or weeks of work she didn't know how to do and couldn't afford to hire someone else to complete. She had $800 to her name when she bought the property. Now she had $63 and change. The town offered little in the way of support. She visited the local hardware store, a cramped space filled with tools and supplies that smelled of sawdust and oil, and explained her situation to the owner, a man in his 60s, with calloused hands and a skeptical expression. He listened politely, nodded occasionally, and when she finished, he told her the truth she already knew, but didn't want to hear. That building's been a problem for years. The previous owner, well, let's just say, it's got a history. You're not the first person to think they could fix it up. You probably won't be the last. But fixing it right would cost more than the place is worth. You'd be better off tearing it down and starting fresh. She thanked him, bought a few basic tools with money she couldn't afford to spend, and left before he could see the tears starting to form in her eyes. On the way back to the shack, she passed a small diner where a group of locals sat drinking coffee and talking in low voices. As she walked by, one of them looked up, recognized her as the stranger who had moved into the Houston place, and said something to the others that made them all turn and stare. She heard fragments of their conversation carried on the wind. Crazy to buy that wreck. Won't last a month. Those poor kids. She walked faster, her face burning with shame. That evening, she sat on the sagging front porch with Emma beside her, watching the sun sink into the ocean in a blaze of orange and purple that felt almost cruel in its beauty. How could the world be so stunning and so harsh at the same time? How could the same landscape that offered such visual grace also house so much struggle and decay? Emma leaned against her shoulder, quiet for a long time, before finally speaking. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Sarah wanted to lie, wanted to tell her daughter that everything would be fine, that they would fix the house and build a life and be happy here by the ocean. But she was so tired of lying, so exhausted by the effort of pretending that hope alone could overcome reality. Instead, she said, "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise I'm going to try." It was the most honest answer she had given in months. The work began the next day, not because she felt ready, but because there was no alternative. She couldn't afford to wait for inspiration or courage or a better plan. She had to start, had to do something, anything, to prove to herself and her daughters that they hadn't made a terrible mistake, even though part of her knew they had. She started with the roof, the most urgent problem. Rain was forecast for later in the week, and the existing damage was already severe enough that another storm would likely render the entire structure uninhabitable. She borrowed a ladder from a neighbor who seemed more curious than helpful, climbed onto the roof with a hammer and a box of nails she had bought at the hardware store, and spent the entire day patching holes with plywood she scavenged from the boarded-up windows. The work was terrifying. The roof shifted under her weight, the shingles crumbled when she stepped on them, and twice she nearly slipped off the edge, catching herself at the last second by grabbing onto a rafter that felt only marginally more stable than the surface beneath her feet. By sunset, she had managed to cover the worst of the gaps, creating a patchwork barrier that wouldn't win any awards for craftsmanship, but might at least keep the rain out for a few more weeks. Her hands were blistered and bleeding, her arms shook with exhaustion, and her back ached in ways she didn't know were possible. But the roof was covered, and that small victory felt like more than she had accomplished in months. The next day she tackled the windows, removing the rotting plywood and replacing it with sheets of clear plastic she bought, with money she told herself she would somehow repay. The plastic let in light for the first time since they had arrived, transforming the dim, cave-like interior into something that almost resembled a living space. Emma and Lily helped her tape the edges, their small hands careful and precise, and when they finished, they stood back and admired their work with a pride that broke Sarah's heart. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Day by day, she made progress. She ripped out the moldy drywall in the bedroom, exposing the studs beneath, which were stained, but mostly solid. She scrubbed the floors with bleach and water she carried in buckets from a neighbor's hose, the chemical smell burning her lungs, but killing the mold that had spread through every corner. She patched holes in the walls with spackle and pieces of scrap wood, creating a surface that was uneven but functional. She cleaned out the bathroom, removing the rusted fixtures and scrubbing the space until it no longer smelled like decay. But for every problem she solved, two more appeared. The electrical wiring was so old and damaged that she didn't dare try to restore power, fearing the whole place might catch fire if she flipped a switch. The plumbing was beyond repair, the pipes corroded through in multiple places, requiring a complete replacement she couldn't afford. The foundation, she discovered one morning, while crawling beneath the house to inspect a soft spot in the floor, was cracked and settling unevenly, which explained the tilt she had noticed the first day. Fixing that would require jacks and concrete and expertise she didn't possess. The money ran out faster than she had feared. Within 2 weeks, her $63 had dwindled to $12, spent on nails, plastic sheeting, cleaning supplies, and food that was getting harder to stretch across 3 meals a day. She started skipping breakfast, telling her daughters she wasn't hungry, giving them the larger portions at lunch and dinner while she ate the scraps. She lost weight, her clothes hanging looser, her face gaunt in the cracked mirror she had found in the debris. The neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and judgment. Some offered help, small gestures like lending tools or dropping off bags of donated clothes for the girls. Others kept their distance, as though poverty might be contagious, as though associating with someone so clearly failing might somehow taint them by proximity. She heard the whispers when she walked to the general store to buy bread and peanut butter, the only foods she could afford in quantity. Poor thing. Doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. Should never have brought those kids here. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Her sister called once, a brief conversation filled with tense silences and unspoken accusations. Sarah told her they were fine, that the house was coming together, that the girls were adjusting. Her sister didn't believe her. Sarah could hear it in the flatness of her responses, but she didn't push. The call ended with a promise to talk again soon, a promise both of them knew would probably go unfulfilled. At night, after her daughters were asleep, Sarah sat on the porch and stared at the ocean, listening to the waves crash against the shore with a rhythm that felt both soothing and relentless. She thought about giving up, about admitting defeat, about calling her sister and begging for help, even though she knew what that help would cost. She thought about the people in town who had laughed at her decision, who had warned her she was making a mistake, who were probably waiting for the day she would pack up and leave, proving them right. But she also thought about her daughters, about the way Emma had started smiling again when the plastic went up on the windows and light flooded the room, about the way Lily had decorated her corner of the bedroom with drawings she had made on scraps of paper, creating beauty in the midst of decay. They believed in her, believed that she could make this work, and that belief was both a gift and a burden she couldn't bring herself to abandon. So she kept going, kept working, kept hoping that somehow, some way, the effort would be enough. She didn't know yet that beneath the rotting floorboards, hidden in a space she hadn't discovered, lay something that would change everything. She didn't know that the building she had bought for $800 held a secret that had been waiting decades to be found. All she knew was that she had to survive one more day, and then one more after that, and trust that eventually the path forward would reveal itself. The ocean roared in the darkness, indifferent to her struggle, indifferent to her hope, offering nothing but the promise that tomorrow the sun would rise again, and she would have to decide once more whether to keep fighting or let the tide carry her away. 3 weeks into living in the beach shack, Sarah discovered the first clue completely by accident. She had been working on reinforcing the living room floor, trying to address a particularly soft section near the far wall, where the boards sagged noticeably whenever anyone walked across them. The work was slow and frustrating, requiring her to crawl beneath the house through the cramped, damp crawl space that smelled of earth and mildew, and things she tried not to think about too carefully. The space beneath the floor was barely 3 feet high, forcing her to move on her hands and knees, a flashlight clenched between her teeth, splinters catching on her clothes and hair. She had been replacing rotted support beams with scavenged lumber, a task that left her covered in dirt and spider webs, and questioning every decision that had led her to this moment. As she wedged a new beam into place, her hand slipped against something that didn't feel like wood or earth. It was smooth, metallic, cold, even in the humid air of the crawl space. She shifted position, aiming the flashlight downward, and saw it. A corner of something buried just beneath the surface layer of packed dirt. At first, she thought it might be an old pipe or a piece of discarded building material, but as she brushed away the soil with her fingers, the shape became clearer. It was rectangular, definitely metal, with a texture that suggested it had been deliberately placed rather than accidentally dropped. Her curiosity overcame her exhaustion. She dug more carefully now, scooping away handfuls of dirt, widening the area around the object until she could grasp it firmly. It took several minutes of careful extraction, working the piece back and forth to loosen it from the soil that had held it for who knew how long. When it finally came free, she nearly dropped it in surprise. It was a metal panel, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, heavy and solid, with a seam running around its edge that suggested it was designed to be opened. But there was no obvious handle, no lock, no visible mechanism for access. Just smooth metal with a surface that had been protected from rust by whatever coating had been applied decades earlier. She crawled backward out of the crawl space, dragging the panel with her, and emerged into the daylight, squinting and filthy, but electrified with the strange thrill of discovery. Emma and Lily, who had been playing outside, came running when they saw her. "What is it, Mom?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Sarah wasn't sure how to answer. She laid the panel on the ground and examined it more closely in the light. The metal was thick, industrial grade, the kind used for security or storage. The seam around the edge was precise, machined rather than welded, suggesting professional construction. And along one corner, nearly worn away by time, was a faint engraving, 3 letters that had once been clear but were now barely visible. W.H. She sat back on her heels, her mind working through possibilities. The previous owner of the property had been mentioned briefly by the gas station attendant, something about the Houston place, but she hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now, looking at those initials, something clicked in her memory. She pulled out her phone, grateful that she still had a few gigabytes of data left in her prepaid plan, and searched for the property's history. What she found made her hands start to shake. The beach shack, condemned and worthless as it now appeared, had once been owned by Whitney Houston. Not the main residence, not one of the mansions or estates that appeared in magazines and celebrity news, but a private retreat a place she had purchased in the early 1992s for privacy and escape from the pressures of fame. The property records showed she had owned it for nearly 15 years before her death, though she had rarely visited in the later years, and after Hurricane Iris had damaged the structure severely, it had been abandoned entirely, eventually falling into foreclosure and passing through several owners before ending up in the auction where Sarah had found it. The realization hit her with a force that made her lightheaded. She was living in Whitney Houston's former beach retreat. The structure she had bought for $800, the wreck that everyone had mocked her for purchasing, had once belonged to one of the most famous singers in the world. The metal panel she had just pulled from beneath the floor suddenly felt different in her hands, heavier with implication. She looked at the initials again. W.H. Whitney Houston. That evening, after her daughters were asleep, Sarah examined the panel more carefully, running her fingers along the seam, searching for any way to open it. She tried prying it with a screwdriver, tapping around the edges, applying pressure to different points, but nothing worked. The panel was sealed tight, designed to resist casual attempts at access. She considered smashing it open with a hammer, but hesitated, some instinct warning her that whatever was inside might be valuable and that damaging it carelessly could be a mistake she would regret. She spent the next 2 days researching, using the library's free Wi-Fi to search for information about Whitney Houston's properties, her habits, her life, during the years she owned the beach shack. Most of what she found was focused on the singer's larger estates, her struggles with addiction, her turbulent marriage, her eventual death, but scattered through the articles and fan sites were mentions of a private retreat by the ocean, a place she had used to escape, to write music, to find solitude when the world became too overwhelming. One fan site even had a photo, grainy and distant, showing Whitney standing on a beach with a weathered gray building visible in the background. Sarah's building. The discovery consumed her thoughts in a way that temporarily pushed aside her immediate worries about money and survival. She couldn't stop thinking about the sealed panel, about what it might contain, about why it had been hidden beneath the floor of a beach shack rather than kept in a bank vault or mansion safe. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that this wasn't random, that the panel had been placed there deliberately, hidden in a location only someone with intimate knowledge of the property would know about. She called a locksmith in a neighboring town, described the panel without explaining where it came from or what she suspected it might be, and asked if he could open it without damaging the contents. The price he quoted made her stomach drop, $250, money she absolutely did not have. She thanked him and ended the call, her mind already working through alternatives. She could try to open it herself, risk damaging whatever was inside, but save the money. She could wait, continue working on the house, hope that eventually she would earn enough to afford professional help. Or she could tell someone, ask for help, admit that she had found something that might be valuable and needed assistance figuring out what to do with it. The last option felt the most dangerous. She had already been judged by this town, already been labeled as the crazy woman who bought a condemned shack with money she didn't have. If she told people she thought she had found something valuable, they would either think she was delusional or, worse, they would find a way to take it from her. The property was hers legally, but she had learned enough about the world to know that legal ownership didn't always protect people without money or power from those who had both. That night, she lay awake, the metal panel hidden beneath her makeshift bed, her mind spinning through scenarios and possibilities. What if it contained documents, contracts, personal items of sentimental value, but no financial worth? What if it was empty, a storage box placed there decades ago and cleaned out before the property was abandoned? What if it did contain something valuable and opening it triggered some kind of legal complication, questions about inheritance, or estate rights, or taxes, She couldn't begin to navigate. But beneath all those fears was something else. A growing, irresistible conviction that this panel was important, that it represented a turning point, that whatever lay inside had been waiting for her specifically to find it. It was a feeling that made no rational sense, but she couldn't shake it. The universe had taken so much from her, had beaten her down so relentlessly that she had almost stopped believing in the possibility of things getting better. Maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when the tide would turn. Maybe this was the overlooked opportunity everyone else had dismissed, the chance she had been working toward without knowing it. The next morning, she made her decision. She would open the panel herself, not with brute force, but carefully, methodically, the same way she had approached every other impossible task in the past month. She would treat it like a puzzle, study it until she understood its mechanism, and find a way to access whatever was inside without destroying it. If she failed, if the contents turned out to be worthless, or if she damaged them beyond repair, at least she would know she had tried. And if she succeeded, if the panel contained something that could change their lives, then all the mockery and doubt and struggle would have been worth it. She waited until Emma and Lily left for the school bus, the one concession to normalcy she had managed to maintain by enrolling them in the local elementary school, despite their transient situation. Once they were gone, she retrieved the panel from its hiding place, set it on the cleanest section of floor she could find, and began her work. She started by examining every inch of the seam, looking for weaknesses or points where the seal had degraded over time. She tested different tools, thin screwdrivers, putty knives, even a butter knife, sliding them gently into the gap and applying the lightest possible pressure. Hours passed. The morning sun shifted across the floor, creating moving patterns of light and shadow that marked the passage of time she barely noticed. Her fingers ached, her eyes burned from concentration, but she kept working, kept probing, kept searching for the one spot that would give way and reveal the mechanism holding the panel closed. And then, just as the frustration was beginning to overwhelm her, she felt it. A slight depression along one edge, barely noticeable, a spot where the metal seemed fractionally thinner than the surrounding area. She pressed harder, and something inside clicked. The panel didn't spring open dramatically. It released slowly, the seal breaking with a faint hiss of air that had been trapped inside for decades. She lifted the cover carefully, her hands trembling, her breath caught in her throat, and looked down at what lay inside. The contents were wrapped in thick plastic, sealed tightly to protect them from moisture and decay. She could see shapes through the translucent material, rectangular objects stacked neatly, filling the compartment completely. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. This was it. This was the moment that would either vindicate her decision or prove it had been as foolish as everyone said. She peeled back the plastic, layer by layer, until the contents were fully exposed. And when she finally saw what Whitney Houston had hidden beneath the floor of her beach retreat, when she understood what she was looking at and what it meant, Sarah Chen began to cry, not from sadness or frustration or exhaustion, but from the overwhelming, impossible relief of realizing that sometimes, against all odds and logic and probability, the universe does answer prayers in ways more profound than we dare to imagine. The compartment was filled with bundles of documents, each one wrapped in plastic and bound with rubber bands that had degraded over time but still held their shape. Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the first bundle, carefully peeling away the protective layers to reveal what lay inside. At first glance, they appeared to be certificates, printed on heavy paper stock with ornate borders and official seals embossed in gold foil. She unfolded one carefully, her eyes scanning the text, and the words made her freeze. United States Treasury bond. Face value, $500,000. Maturity date, the 15th of September, 2024. She read it again, certain she had misunderstood, but the numbers remained the same. $500,000 on a single piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she reached for another bundle, then another. Each one contained similar bonds, denominations varying from $50,000 to $1 million, issued in the 1,990 seconds, with maturity dates that had already passed or were rapidly approaching. She tried to count them, spreading the documents across the floor in neat rows. But her mind couldn't process the numbers properly. 50 bonds, 100, more than that, layered beneath the first tier, but the bonds were just the beginning. Beneath them, wrapped in separate plastic sheeting, was something else. Stacks of what looked like stock certificates, printed on paper so thick and expensive it felt more like fabric than standard print material. She examined the first one closely, her heart racing even faster now. Berkshire Hathaway Class A stock, it read, followed by a certificate number and a date from 1995. The number of shares listed was 100. She didn't know much about stocks, but she knew enough to recognize that name. Warren Buffett's company, one of the most valuable stocks in the world. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and searched for the current price of Berkshire Hathaway Class A shares. When the number appeared on her screen, she had to read it 3 times to convince herself it was real. Each share was worth over $600,000. 100 shares meant $60 million from a single certificate, and there were more beneath it. She counted them mechanically, her mind detached from her body, watching herself from a distance as though this were happening to someone else. 6 certificates total, each representing 100 shares, $360 million in Berkshire Hathaway stock alone. The room spun. She sat down hard on the floor, her legs giving out. The certificates spread around her like some kind of surreal treasure map. This wasn't possible. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. People who bought condemned beach shacks for $800. People who had been sleeping on friends' couches and skipping meals to feed their children. This was the kind of story that appeared in movies or novels, not in the actual, brutal, unforgiving reality she had been living in for the past year. But the documents were real. The weight of them, the texture of the paper, the official seals and signatures, all of it was tangible and undeniable. She picked up one of the bonds again, studying it more carefully, searching for any sign that it might be fake or invalid, or somehow not what it appeared to be. But everything looked legitimate. The serial numbers, the treasury seal, the intricate anti-counterfeiting patterns woven into the paper, these were real United States government bonds, purchased decades ago and left to mature in their hiding place beneath the floor. The stock certificates were equally authentic, each one bearing the Berkshire Hathaway logo, Warren Buffett's signature as chairman, and certificate numbers that she verified online corresponded to legitimate shares issued during the 1,990 seconds. She had no idea how Whitney Houston had acquired them, whether they had been part of her financial planning or gifts from advisors or investments she had made during the height of her career. But somehow, they had ended up here, hidden in a beach shack that most people assumed was worthless, waiting for someone to discover them. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If these documents were legitimate, and that was still a massive if that she needed to verify through proper channels, then she was looking at assets worth more than $250 million, $255 million, by her rough calculation, accounting for the bonds at face value and the stock at current market price. The number was so large it felt abstract, meaningless, in the way that astronomical distances or geological timescales feel meaningless, because the human brain simply isn't equipped to process them in any concrete way. She thought about the $800 she had spent to buy this property, the mockery she had endured from her sister and the townspeople, the nights she had lain awake, wondering if she had made the worst decision of her life. She thought about the eviction notice, the repossessed car, the sold jewelry, the daughters who had watched their mother struggle and fail, and keep struggling anyway. She thought about the hardware store owner, who had told her the building was worth less than the cost to demolish it, the neighbors who had whispered that she wouldn't last a month, the sister who had suggested she give up her children because she was too incompetent to care for them. And then she thought about what this discovery meant, not just financially, though that was overwhelming enough, but symbolically. She had been right, not in the way she had imagined, not because she had successfully fixed up the beach shack and created a home through sheer determination, but in a deeper, stranger way. She had been right to take the risk, right to bet everything on a property no one else wanted, right to trust her instincts, even when they seemed to contradict every rational calculation. The building everyone had dismissed as worthless had turned out to be the most valuable thing she would ever own. But even as the realization settled over her, bringing with it a surge of emotions so powerful she couldn't separate them, joy, relief, vindication, disbelief, she also felt something else, fear, because she knew, with the same instinct that had kept her alive through months of poverty and struggle, that this discovery would change everything in ways she couldn't yet predict. Money, especially this much money, came with complications, questions, people who would want a piece of it, who would challenge her right to it, who would find ways to take it from her if given the chance. She needed help, professional help, from people who understood estate law and financial assets, and the kind of verification process required to convert paper certificates into actual, spendable wealth. But who could she trust? She didn't know any lawyers or accountants, didn't have connections to the kind of people who moved in circles where $250 million discoveries were even remotely within the realm of normal experience. She thought about calling her sister, but dismissed the idea immediately. Her sister would either think she was lying or delusional, or worse, she would believe her, and then try to claim a share of the money, arguing that Sarah owed her for all the time she had offered help, however grudgingly. The townspeople were out of the question too. They had already proven they saw her as an outsider, someone to be pitied or mocked, but not taken seriously. If word got out about what she had found before she had time to secure it properly, she could imagine the chaos that would follow. Claims from people insisting they had some connection to the property or to Whitney Houston's estate. Media attention. Scammers and con artists descending like vultures. The thought made her sick. She gathered the documents carefully, rewrapping them in their plastic sheeting, and returned them to the metal panel. She sealed it, as best she could, then hid it again beneath the floor, this time covering the spot with a piece of plywood so no one would accidentally discover it. The weight of the secret pressed on her like a physical thing. She had always been terrible at keeping secrets, her face too expressive, her emotions too close to the surface. But this one, she knew, she had to protect, until she figured out the next steps. That night, when Emma and Lily came home from school, she hugged them longer than usual, holding them close in a way that made them squirm and laugh, and ask what was wrong. "Nothing's wrong," she told them, forcing her voice to stay calm. "I just love you both so much." They accepted this explanation with the easy trust of children who still believed their mother had everything under control. If only they knew how far from control she actually was, how completely her world had just been upended by a discovery that should have been impossible. She made dinner from the last of their supplies, pasta with margarine and a can of vegetables, and they ate together on the floor since they still had no table. The girls chatted about their day, about their new friends and the art projects they were working on, and the teacher who let them sit outside for reading time when the weather was nice. Sarah listened and smiled and responded automatically. While her mind worked through scenarios and possibilities and dangers she couldn't yet fully articulate. After they fell asleep, she sat on the porch in the darkness, listening to the ocean and thinking about Whitney Houston. Had the singer placed those assets there herself, or had someone done it on her behalf? Had she forgotten about them in the chaos of her later years, the addiction and turmoil that had consumed her life? Or had she hidden them deliberately, insurance against a future that never came, wealth set aside for a purpose she never got the chance to fulfill? The questions swirled without answers. But one thing was certain. Those documents had been waiting in the darkness beneath the floor for over a decade, through hurricanes and foreclosures and transfers of ownership, waiting for someone to find them, and that someone, by a combination of desperation and luck so improbable it felt like fate, was her. Tomorrow she would start making calls. She would find a lawyer, an accountant, someone who could guide her through the process of verifying and claiming the assets. She would be careful, methodical, smart about who she trusted and how much she revealed. But tonight, just for these few hours, she allowed herself to simply sit with the knowledge that everything had changed, that the struggle was over, that her daughters would never go hungry again or watch their mother collapse under the weight of impossible circumstances. The ocean continued its eternal rhythm, waves crashing and retreating, indifferent to human drama. But Sarah felt as though the sound had shifted somehow, as though the same water that had seemed threatening when she first arrived now sounded almost protective, a constant presence guarding the secret she carried. She didn't know yet how the story would end, didn't know what challenges still lay ahead, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that had been absent from her life for so long she had almost forgotten its name. Hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope of someone clinging to dreams against all evidence, but real, solid, justified hope based on something tangible and valuable, and finally, impossibly, hers. The next morning began with the same routine. Breakfast cobbled together from almost nothing. Daughters dressed and ready for school. The walk to the bus stop, through sand and scrub grass that had become familiar in the short time they had lived here. But everything felt different now, charged with a secret energy that Sarah struggled to contain. She hugged Emma and Lily goodbye, watched the bus pull away in a cloud of dust, then returned to the shack with a sense of purpose that had been missing from her movements for months. She had spent most of the night researching, using the last of her phone's data to search for information about estate law, unclaimed assets, and the process of verifying old stock certificates and government bonds. What she learned was both encouraging and daunting. The documents, if authentic, would need to be validated by the issuing institutions, the U.S. Treasury for the bonds, and Berkshire Hathaway's transfer agent for the stock certificates. The process could take weeks or months, would require extensive documentation, and might trigger investigations into the chain of ownership and Whitney Houston's estate. But she also learned something that gave her a surge of confidence. In most cases, the legal owner of a property also owned anything found within or beneath that property, unless it could be proven to have been stolen or placed there illegally. Since Whitney Houston had owned the beach shack when the assets were presumably hidden, and since the property had passed through legal foreclosure and auction to Sarah, there was a strong argument that whatever had been left behind now belonged to her as the current owner. It wasn't a guarantee, nothing in law ever was, but it was a foundation. She made her first call to a law office in the nearest city, a firm that specialized in estate and property law, according to their website. The receptionist who answered sounded bored until Sarah mentioned the nature of her situation, at which point the tone shifted dramatically. She was transferred to a senior partner, a woman named Patricia Knowles, whose voice carried the crisp authority of someone who had spent decades navigating complex legal waters. Sarah explained the situation as clearly as she could: the purchase of the property, the discovery of the sealed panel, the contents that appeared to be authentic but required professional verification. Patricia listened without interrupting, asking only brief questions for clarification. When Sarah finished, there was a pause, then a low whistle. "Miss Chen, if what you're telling me is accurate, this is an extraordinary situation. I'll need to see the documents in person, of course, but based on your description, I believe you may have a legitimate claim to assets of significant value. However, I need to warn you, cases like this can become complicated very quickly. Whitney Houston's estate may have claims. The IRS will certainly be interested, and you'll need to navigate media attention once this becomes public, which it inevitably will." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "I don't want media attention," she said quietly. "I just want to know if this is real, if I can actually claim these assets, if my daughters and I can finally stop struggling." Patricia's voice softened. "I understand. Let's take this one step at a time. First, I need you to bring the documents to my office. Don't tell anyone else about this. Not friends, not family, no one. Secrecy is your best protection right now. Can you be here tomorrow?" Sarah thought about the logistics. The borrowed car she had already returned. The bus ride that would take hours. The money she didn't have for gas or fare. But she also thought about what was at stake, and nodded, even though Patricia couldn't see her. "Yes," she said. "I'll be there." The law office was located in a building that made Sarah feel small and out of place the moment she walked through its polished glass doors. Her clothes were worn and stained from weeks of construction work. Her hands still bore cuts and calluses from handling lumber and tools, and she carried the metal panel wrapped in a garbage bag because it was the only thing she had large enough to conceal it. The receptionist gave her a look that suggested she might be in the wrong place, but when Sarah gave her name, the expression shifted to something between curiosity and professional courtesy. Patricia Knowles met her in a conference room that had windows overlooking the city, a view so different from the scrubby coastal landscape Sarah had grown accustomed to that it felt like entering another world. Patricia was in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with eyes that missed nothing, and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. She gestured for Sarah to sit, waited while Sarah unwrapped the panel and laid out the documents on the polished table, then spent the next 30 minutes examining each one in silence. She used a magnifying glass, held papers up to the light, took photographs with a high-resolution camera, and made notes on a legal pad in handwriting so precise it looked machine-printed. Finally, she sat back and met Sarah's eyes. "These appear to be authentic," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The bonds carry the correct security features for their era. The stock certificates match the style and format used by Berkshire Hathaway during the 1,990 seconds, and the serial numbers don't show any obvious signs of forgery. But appearance isn't proof. I'll need to send these to specialists for forensic analysis, and we'll need to contact the Treasury and Berkshire's transfer agent to verify the serial numbers and confirm the assets haven't been redeemed or invalidated." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Patricia continued, "Even assuming they're authentic, and I believe they are, you're still facing significant challenges. First, we'll need to establish clear chain of custody, proving these documents were legally placed on the property by Whitney Houston or someone acting on her behalf, and that they weren't stolen or removed from her estate improperly. Second, we'll need to address potential tax implications. Assets of this magnitude will attract IRS scrutiny. Third, there may be claims from Whitney Houston's estate or family, arguing that these assets were meant to be included in her will but were overlooked during probate. The list of challenges felt overwhelming, but Patricia wasn't finished. And finally, she said, her expression becoming more serious, you need to prepare yourself for the public reaction. A story like this, single mother buys condemned property for $800 and discovers $250 million in hidden assets, is going to attract massive media attention. Your privacy will be compromised. People will come out of nowhere claiming connections to you or to the property. You'll receive threats, scams, requests for money. Your life is about to change in ways you can't fully anticipate. Sarah felt the weight of it settling over her, but beneath the fear was something else: determination. "I've been through worse," she said quietly. "I've been evicted, judged, mocked. I've skipped meals so my daughters could eat. I've worked on that building until my hands bled because I had no other choice. Whatever comes next, it can't be harder than what I've already survived." Patricia's expression softened. "Good," she said, "because you're going to need that strength. But I want you to know something else. If these assets are validated, if we can establish your legal right to them, you're not just looking at money, you're looking at generational wealth, the kind of security that will change your family's trajectory forever. Your daughters won't just have food and shelter. They'll have education, opportunities, choices you never had. That's worth fighting for." The verification process took 3 weeks. Weeks that felt longer than the months Sarah had spent struggling to survive. Patricia's team worked with specialists who examined the bonds under microscope, checking watermarks and fiber composition and security threads. They contacted the U.S. Treasury's Bureau of the Fiscal Service, providing serial numbers and requesting confirmation that the bonds were legitimate and had not been redeemed. They reached out to Berkshire Hathaway's transfer agent, submitting the stock certificates for authentication and inquiring about the process for transferring them to Sarah's name. During that time, Sarah tried to maintain normal life, or whatever passed for normal, in a beach shack that was slowly becoming habitable, but still had no electricity or running water. She continued working on repairs, partly because the work needed to be done, and partly because she needed the distraction. The town's whispers had quieted somewhat, people losing interest in the spectacle of her struggle, as it became clear she wasn't going to give up and leave. A few neighbors even started treating her with something approaching respect, impressed despite themselves by her stubborn refusal to quit. She told no one about the discovery. Not her sister, not the neighbors, not even her daughters, though that was the hardest secret to keep. Emma kept asking why she seemed distracted, why she checked her phone so obsessively, why she sometimes stared at the ocean with an expression that looked like she was carrying the weight of the world. Sarah deflected with vague reassurances, hating the lies, but knowing that revealing the truth before the assets were verified would be a catastrophic mistake. The call came on a Thursday morning, Patricia's voice carrying an excitement she clearly struggled to contain professionally. "Sarah, we have confirmation. The bonds are authentic, totaling $85 million, including accumulated interest. The stock certificates are legitimate, representing 600 shares of Berkshire Hathaway Class A, stock currently valued at approximately $370 million. Combined with the bonds, you're looking at total assets worth $455 million. The number was so far beyond what Sarah had calculated that she couldn't process it. She had to ask Patricia to repeat it, certain she had misheard. $455 million? Patricia's voice was warm. Yes, the Berkshire stock has appreciated significantly since the 1,990 seconds when these certificates were issued. Whitney Houston made an extraordinarily wise investment, whether she realized it or not. Sarah sat down heavily on the porch steps, her legs unable to support her. This changed everything, not just incrementally but fundamentally. She wasn't just escaping poverty, she was entering a realm of wealth most people couldn't even imagine. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now," Patricia said, "we file the necessary paperwork to transfer the assets to your name. We work with the IRS to ensure all tax obligations are met, which will be substantial but still leave you with generational wealth. And we prepare for the media storm, because once this becomes public record, every news outlet in the country is going to want your story. The process of transferring the assets took another month, a month of paperwork and verification and legal maneuvering that Sarah didn't fully understand but trusted Patricia to navigate. During that time, word began to leak, first as rumors in the town, whispers that the woman in the beach shack had found something valuable, then as speculation online as someone connected to the verification process shared information they shouldn't have. By the time the assets were officially transferred to Sarah's name, the story had already begun to spread beyond the small coastal town to regional news, then national outlets, then international media. The headlines appeared everywhere, each one more sensational than the last. Single mother finds $455M fortune in condemned beach shack. Whitney Houston's hidden treasure discovered in beach retreat. Woman's $800 gamble becomes biggest windfall in history. The stories varied in accuracy and tone, some portraying Sarah as a clever investor who had seen potential others missed, others framing her as impossibly lucky, a modern-day lottery winner who had stumbled into wealth through pure chance. Few of them captured the reality of what she had endured, the months of poverty and struggle and doubt that had preceded the discovery. The attention was overwhelming. News crews appeared outside the beach shack, their cameras pointed at the weathered structure that now represented the ultimate rags to riches story. Reporters shouted questions as Sarah walked to the car Patricia had arranged for her, questions about how she felt, what she would do with the money, whether she had known what she was buying when she purchased the property. She ignored them all, following Patricia's advice to make no public statements until the legal process was complete. But the attention also brought something else: vindication. The townspeople who had mocked her, the neighbors who had whispered that she wouldn't last a month, the hardware store owner who had told her the building was worthless, all of them had to confront the reality that they had been catastrophically wrong. The property they had dismissed as condemned wreckage had contained more wealth than their entire town's combined net worth. The woman they had pitied and judged had become, overnight, one of the wealthiest people in the state. Some of them approached her with apologies, awkward attempts to walk back their earlier skepticism. Others avoided her entirely, embarrassed by their own short-sightedness. A few tried to claim they had always believed in her, rewriting history in real time to position themselves as supporters rather than doubters. Sarah accepted the apologies with grace, but didn't forget who had helped her when she had nothing and who had only appeared once she had everything. Her sister called, finally, after weeks of silence. The conversation was stilted, filled with long pauses and unspoken tensions. "Congratulations," her sister said, the word sounding forced. "I saw the news." Sarah waited, wondering if an actual apology would follow, if her sister would acknowledge the things she had said, the judgment she had passed, the suggestion that Sarah give up her daughters because she wasn't capable of caring for them. But the apology never came. Instead, her sister asked if Sarah needed help managing the money, if she had thought about family, if she remembered everything their parents had done for her. Sarah kept her voice calm. "I remember everything," she said quietly. "I remember who was there when I had nothing, and who only called when I had something." The line was silent for a moment. Then her sister made an excuse and ended the call. Sarah felt a pang of sadness, not because the relationship was damaged, but because it revealed something that had probably always been true, but was only now visible in the harsh light of changed circumstances. The first thing Sarah did with the money, even before the full amount was available, was secure her daughter's future. She set up educational trusts that would cover their schooling from elementary through graduate school, established investment accounts that would grow with compound interest, and purchased life insurance policies that would ensure they would be cared for, even if something happened to her. Only after those foundations were laid did she turn her attention to her own needs and desires. She hired a construction crew to fully renovate the beach shack. Not because she needed to live there anymore. She could afford any house she wanted, but because the building had become meaningful in ways that transcended its physical structure. It represented the moment when her life had changed, the place where impossible hope had been rewarded. The renovation transformed the structure completely. New foundation, new roof, new walls, new everything. But the contractors followed her instructions to preserve certain elements: the porch, where she had sat watching the ocean during the hardest nights, the corner of the living room where her daughters had made their first drawings on the walls, the spot beneath the floor where the metal panel had waited. When the work was finished, the beach shack was no longer condemned or decrepit. It was beautiful, a testament to what could be built from ruins with enough determination and, yes, a dose of extraordinary luck. But Sarah didn't live there. Instead, she donated it to a non-profit that provided transitional housing for families escaping poverty. Families like hers had been people who needed not just shelter, but a place to rebuild their lives and recover their sense of possibility. She bought a different house nearby, smaller than she could afford but large enough for comfort. A place where Emma and Lily could grow up with stability and security, but without the isolation that sometimes came with extreme wealth. She hired tutors to help them catch up on the education they had missed during the months of instability, enrolled them in programs for art and music and sports, gave them opportunities to explore interests they never could have pursued before. But she also made sure they understood where they had come from. The apartment they had been evicted from, the couch they had slept on, the beach shack where they had lived without electricity or water while their mother worked until her hands bled. She didn't want them to forget the struggle, not because she wanted to traumatize them, but because she believed the memory would make them stronger, more empathetic, more aware of how quickly circumstances could change and how many people were still fighting battles they themselves had escaped. She established a foundation focused on housing security, providing grants to families facing eviction, funding repairs for substandard housing, supporting organizations that helped people trapped in poverty find pathways to stability. She named it the Whitney Houston Second Chance Foundation, honoring the woman whose investment had made everything possible. She donated millions to hurricane relief efforts, remembering how Hurricane Iris had damaged the beach shack and created the circumstances that led to its abandonment and eventual sale. She funded scholarships for children of single parents, emergency assistance programs for families in crisis, legal aid for people facing housing disputes. The giving felt right in a way that spending on herself never quite did. She bought nice things, of course, a reliable car, clothes that weren't threadbare, furniture and appliances, and all the small comforts she had gone without for so long. But the real satisfaction came from using the wealth to address the problems she had experienced firsthand, to catch other people before they fell as far as she had, to create the kind of safety net she had desperately needed and never found. The media attention gradually faded, as it always did, moving on to newer stories and fresher dramas. But the transformation in Sarah's life remained. She woke up in a house that was warm and dry, made breakfast for her daughters without worrying whether there would be enough food for lunch, watched them leave for school, knowing they would return to stability rather than chaos. The constant background hum of anxiety that had colored every moment of the past year was finally, blessedly, silent. One evening, about 6 months after the assets had been transferred, Sarah drove back to the beach where the shack had stood before its renovation. She walked along the shore, the same shore she had walked during the darkest days, when she had wondered if she had made a catastrophic mistake. if she had doomed her daughters through her own foolish desperation. The ocean looked the same, waves crashing with the same rhythmic indifference, but everything else had changed. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the eviction, the desperate search for any alternative, the discovery of the auction listing, the $800 that had felt like her last chance. She thought about the mockery, the judgment, the night spent wondering if she had the strength to keep going. She thought about the moment she had pulled the metal panel from beneath the floor, the discovery that had seemed impossible, the verification process that had proven it real. And she thought about what it all meant, not just the money, though that was transformative, but the deeper truth the experience had revealed, that sometimes the things everyone else dismisses as worthless turn out to be invaluable. That desperation can lead to decisions that seem foolish but prove inspired. That the universe, for all its cruelty and randomness, occasionally rewards stubbornness with grace. That the worst moments of our lives can, through paths we never could have predicted, lead directly to the best. She didn't believe in fate, didn't think some cosmic plan had guided her to that specific property at that specific moment. But she did believe in the power of refusing to give up, of taking risks when every rational voice said to play it safe, of trusting instincts even when they contradicted conventional wisdom. She had bought a condemned beach shack with her last $800, and everyone had told her she was making a mistake. They had been right about almost everything. The building was worthless. The repairs would cost more than it was worth. The decision was born from desperation rather than sense. But they had been wrong about the one thing that mattered most. Sometimes, hidden beneath the surface of what seems worthless, beneath the decay and the mockery and the judgment, lies something extraordinary, waiting for someone brave or desperate or stubborn enough to look. The waves continued their eternal rhythm, and Sarah stood watching them, no longer struggling, no longer desperate, but still fundamentally the same person who had arrived here months ago with nothing but hope, and her daughters, and a willingness to fight for a future that seemed impossible. The ocean had witnessed her transformation, had been present for every moment, from the lowest depths to the highest peaks. And as the sun set over the water, painting the sky in colors that felt like celebration, Sarah allowed herself to believe what she had never quite dared to believe during the dark days: that she had made it, that her daughters were safe, that the struggle was over, and that sometimes, against all odds and reason and probability, the desperate gambles we take when we have nothing left to lose turn out to be the best decisions we ever make. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.